So I'd like you to begin by turning to 1 Corinthians chapter number 1, and then we'll go to Romans chapter number 14. But I want to begin by looking in 1 Corinthians chapter number 1. We'll turn then to Romans chapter 14. I don't know if you've ever considered, just within this small body of believers, the variety of backgrounds that exist here. In many ways, it's somewhat unique. We've got some who, from a geographical background, there are some of you who have been born right in this area and within 30, 40, 50 miles, and you've never once moved, you've never seen anything else, you don't even know the Mississippi River exists. And so that's it, and this has been your entire area. We've got several who are from the north, some from Illinois, some from, if I'm thinking correctly, New Hampshire, and I know we've got a New Yorker who is not with us tonight, but is instead at work. We've got then opposite extreme of that, some from South Carolina. We consider that one almost a third world country, but not quite, but I'm teasing there. And then we have Western North Carolina versus Eastern North Carolina, and we find those varieties here as well. We find Illinois, we find, let's see, I'm trying to think, Thomas says, I know Indiana at least at some point in time. Am I correct? Iowa, that's it. I'm sorry there. So again, we find a variety of backgrounds. Isn't it interesting that God has placed all of us here in a little town in North Carolina, Western North Carolina? It's a pretty amazing concept. And then let's take a look not only at a geographical background, but let's just consider for a moment the spiritual background. Some of you were saved at an early age. You've been brought up in church, and you really, this is all you've ever known. Your parents were saved. They brought you to church, and you had not very many options as far as going to church. You were going, and you were going to go whenever they told you you were going to go, and that was pretty much every Sunday, and for the most part, every service. There were times, I'm sure, when you hated it, yet when you look back at it now, what you find is that God used that in a variety of ways. Then there are others of you who were not brought up in a Christian home, and some of you in here may very well have even been first generation individuals who were saved in your own family. And you are, in many ways, somewhat of the, I don't want to say the lone wolf, but in many ways that's almost what that amounts to. And there is a sense of you've started a different aspect of a Christian home. You weren't brought up in one. Some of you were saved at a later age in your life, and you come with a variety of backgrounds. Some involved in all sorts of stuff that, thank God, to this day, you've been delivered from. Others perhaps were saved later on in life, yet they still didn't get involved in a whole lot of sin and a lot of wicked lifestyle. They just simply thought they could earn their way to heaven by their own good works. It's a variety of spiritual backgrounds. There are a variety of occupational backgrounds. We've got a church that is very diverse. We've got all sorts of different types of employment, and we've seen all sorts of different individuals who have, even in times past, been a part of our church, but there are all sorts of different occupations. Some have been functioning within plants, others have been on mail routes, some have been in nursing, some have been in teaching, some have been in all sorts of businesses. Mike, yes, you're the one I'm thinking of. Everything from selling hot dogs to selling insurance and who knows what else in between. Some are very gifted at operating heavy machinery. Others are very gifted at sitting on the couch doing absolutely nothing. Some in this place have a job that I don't care what you think about your job, absolutely stinks. Day in and day out, and that would be Cheryl Benton. It does not matter what her job, what you think your job is. If you ever doubt it, let me just encourage you on a nice hot summer day, you go visit Cheryl for lunch, and you will find that Cheryl's job truly stinks. And if you have no idea what she does, she is, you're not the head, are you? Anyway, city of Morganton, what goes out of buildings, okay, in the water lines. We'll talk that regard. And boy, what a lovely life. And then we've got others who have worked in various city communities. Man, we've got a variety of backgrounds, okay? We've got some who are extremely young and some who are extremely younger. And it just goes, every spectrum exists all across the board. I want you to notice 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse number 10, because even with all of these diversities and all of these different backgrounds, notice what God's desire is for us as believers. Verse number 10 of 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you." And I love the way this verse ends. "But that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." We talk oftentimes of God's demand for purity within a church and within the life of a believer. I also want you to understand that one of the greatest hindrances to the cause of Christ is a lack of unity. Oftentimes what we find is that groups who are not unified have allowed differences of opinion to begin to now drive a wedge between them. We're not speaking as much on this topic in Romans 14 on all of the things that are going outside of the church. What we're speaking on instead are the relationships that exist within the church. God expects and God demands that His people be united. There's a cry today for unity along all sorts of levels. Many of them, however, disregard truth. I need you to understand that the ultimate goal is not unity. You have to determine around what it is that you are going to be united. Because there are lots of groups who are united. But the thing that they are united on is very detrimental to society. It is wrong. Just simply being united with people is not automatically the solution. But what we find is that when truth enters in and individuals are willing to unite themselves to that truth, and they're willing to hold the standard of God and of His Word as the most important thing in their life, then what you'll find is that unity is going to be achieved because we are all pursuing the same goal. If you were to take and kind of picture maybe a little bit of a triangle where we put the goal of Christ-likeness at the very point of that triangle, and then we take two people on opposite extremes, and when we talked about all the differences, it wouldn't take long for us at all to put people on opposite extremes, okay? You still have the battle of the North and the South still going on today. So let's take two people from opposite extremes. If they are pursuing the same goal, as they work their way up, what is happening is they are also drawing themselves closer to each other. That is the essence of what God wants you and me when it comes to our Christian growth. How then do we handle these kinds of attitudes and these kinds of relationships? Because the reality is that we all bring something unique to the table. We all bring something different into the ministry into which God has called us, and it is important then that we understand that and identify that, but it's also important that we learn, you know what, there are times when we have to learn to play nice in the sandbox. There are times when we're going to have to learn, we have to be able to get along in order to be able to further the cause of Christ. Let's turn now to Romans chapter 14, and we kind of introduced this and spent a lot of time introducing it last particular session that we were in this on, and we talk about Christian liberty. There are all sorts of ideas that come out there, and we gave some kind of some guidelines to help us with this idea of Christianity. Let me just point out 4 of those things that we mentioned, and I just want to do it as an introduction, and I'm not going to spend much time on them at all. Number 1, we said that freedom is not the right to do whatever you please. Freedom has to operate within certain restraints. That is anarchy when you start into an idea of I can just do whatever I want to do. Number 2, Christian liberty, and this is going to be a key that we're going to emphasize repeatedly, is not a justification to do wrong. Many people have said, that's the Christian liberty and I have a right to be able to do that. Oftentimes what they are claiming they have a right to be able to do, an individual who is well versed in the Word of God can take and point to passages and say, what about this passage here? Well, they won't typically have anything to do with that because they are more concerned about doing whatever it is that they want to do, which leads to number 3, Christian liberty is not the means to a selfish pursuit of pleasure. It's not about, well, I just want to do this, and they need to get over it. That's the wrong approach when it comes to this. And then let me also point out number 4, as we've already studied, harsh criticism of differing viewpoints must be avoided. Harsh criticism of differing viewpoints must be avoided. It's amazing to me how we conclude someone's character based on something that is a very isolated incident. Someone may pull out in front of us, for example, in traffic, and we might make a statement such as, man, that person's a jerk, or what an idiot. That's actually talking quite a bit about their character, and we're basing it on the fact that they pulled out in front of us in traffic. Is that not a rather strong conclusion to come up with from very limited facts? Okay. The reality is oftentimes we'll do the same thing. Okay, when it comes to this matter of Christianity, if somebody differs with us, then it's a problem. And it's oftentimes quite a big challenge for us to recognize, you know what, sometimes your way is not always the right way, and sometimes it's not even the best way. All right, Paul begins in Romans 14 dealing with 2 specific issues. One is the issue of what a Christian can eat and not eat, and the other is the observance of special days. It's interesting that in both of these, Paul never does take side with one side or the other and say this is the side that's right and this is the side that's wrong. Because in both of these cases, there really was no right and wrong. What we were dealing with is truly an issue that is what we have often described as a gray matter, one that the Bible neither condemns nor does it condone. Again, let me point out to you, as I did last week, the Bible does not have just a little bit of black and a little bit of white and this whole big expanse of gray in between. There are a lot of very general commands that will encompass a lot of our activity. We talked about some of them: abstain from all appearance of evil. That is a very broad command that encompasses a whole lot of things. There are problems that are going to come about with that. And I think we need to be very careful with how people are going to perceive our actions to be. And that's not necessarily living in fear of what others may think. It is instead living in hopes of not in any way detracting from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's ultimately the goal. Now, we identified one principle already, and that is this. Number 1, we said to recognize different levels of maturity exist. Notice verse number 1. Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. Let's recognize that there are different levels of maturity. There are people who have been saved for a long time who have never really grown in their walk with the Lord. They are immature in their walk with the Lord. And then there are those who have perhaps been saved for a very short time, yet they have grown in remarkable strides. They may in actuality be more mature than the person who has been saved for years and years and years, simply because of the rate of growth. There are those who have been saved for years and they have grown exponentially for years. And then there are those who just simply immediately get saved. There are all of these spectrums, and you can find about every single spectrum in every single church. You'll find that those things exist. So let's recognize then, before we ever get into all of this, that there are differing levels of maturity. A person who is weak in the faith is a person in this passage who would be spiritually immature and is experiencing in many ways a limitation. But the command is then given to the person who is stronger in the faith, and the command is you are to receive him, you are to welcome him into your home or your circle of acquaintances. Do not remove him or shun him. Again, often when disagreement takes place, that is exactly what happens. We just don't want to talk to that person. Why? Because we had some sort of a disagreement, and now we're content to be at polar opposite of each other. That's not how God intends for us to function. But the Bible says you're to receive him, but not to doubtful disputations, and the idea is that you are not to bring him in to argue and quarrel about opinions. It describes a person who would engage in a verbal conflict because of differing viewpoints and suggests actually a very, I would say, hostile sort of argument that takes place. Paul says this isn't right. We need to recognize instead that there are maturity. And then he uses as an illustration of this, verse number 2. It's the dietary issues. One believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. As I mentioned, and we were kind of bringing all of this into a conclusion, but I mentioned this very quickly. Romans chapter 14, and if you were to take and do a little bit more in-depth study on 1 Corinthians chapter number 8, you would find the issue of meats in 1 Corinthians 8 as being meats offered to idols. Is it okay for a Christian to eat a meat that has been offered to an idol? Well, depending on what the situation is, it may very well be perfectly fine. If you were saved from idolatry and that represents to you part of idolatry from which you were saved, you may struggle to eat that. That's okay. Don't eat it. Okay? It's very simple. If you struggled to do that, for you, that would be sin to engage in that kind of behavior. I may, perhaps, have not been saved from that kind of a background. I look at the meat that had been offered to an idol, and I see it's offered now at a discounted price. To me, this is great stewardship. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm going to go ahead and get this meat. I can eat it, and I can eat it in good conscience. Is it possible that both of us could be right? Yes, it is in that particular case. All right, this is kind of the focus here. So you've got one person who eats meats, and another person who is actually described as being weak would suggest, and I'll use the concept of the vegetarian. Now, this is not a passage that is used to teach whether or not you should be a vegetarian. Okay, do not draw those kinds of conclusions from Romans 14. If you choose to do so, you choose to do so of your own accord. All right, but now let's put this into a little bit of the perspective. Let's keep the meat being offered to idols as just an illustration. Let's say that I know you can't eat meat offered to idols. I picked on Mike and all of his variety of jobs. I'll pick on Mike again with the meat. Let's say that meat, to Mike has been saved from a background of idolatry, and to him, he knows what that represents. Okay? It's a problem for him to eat it. Let's say that I invite him over to my home, and I go ahead and find this discounted meat, and I know that it's a problem for Mike. We get down there, and we sit down, and we start eating it, and we get halfway through it, and I tell him, boy, I'll tell you what, this meat, I sure am glad Bale didn't eat this one, because this was a good one, wasn't it? What have I just done to him? You see the problem? Now I have created an issue for him. Do I have to wave that in his face and say, ha, 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 ha? No. Do I have to in some way be rude about that? No. 1 Corinthians 8 also talks about, well, what happens if you're the one who's invited to someone's house? So now the role reverses. I know where I got that meat. Mike does not. Does he come and say, hey, before I eat this, was this offered to idols? According to 1 Corinthians 8, he should not do that. You should sit down and just simply eat it. Okay? You see that there's a mutual respect that goes towards each other. That's the essence of what is being taught here. So you've got one in Romans 14 who believes he can eat everything. And you've got one who believes he cannot. Recognize that different levels of maturity exist. Do not be harsh in the one who has a differing viewpoint than you, regardless of which direction it is. And by the way, generally what I have found is that the person who is the weaker one is often the harshest one when it comes to the differing viewpoints. It is amazing to me what various topics that have been addressed or that I have encountered in various capacities, and to hear people just adamant as to how I feel about something when that's not at all how I feel about it. And the reality is they're on the weaker side of things, and they're oftentimes very harsh and very negative in things. And be very careful that you don't do that. And you'll see comments along the lines of, well, I sure am glad I'm no longer in the bondage of independent fundamental Baptists, and they'll just go on and on and on with a Bud Light in hand. Well, what's that have to do with anything? Okay? And they blast those who have a differing viewpoint, and clearly, by the way, I don't think that's a matter of Christian liberty either. I think that's a matter of right and wrong, and I think you can establish that in the Word of God. But recognize this, that there are differing levels of maturity. Let me also go on to number 2. Recognize that God has welcomed both individuals. Notice verse number 3. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received them. The essence of the contrast is seen, but there's a word in the Greek, we've referenced it a number of times, oftentimes left untranslated. It's indicating a contrast. It doesn't have to be translated because the contrast is pretty well clearly seen. You've got two different people. But let's go ahead and use the word. On the one hand, you've got an individual who is unable to eat. Okay? On the other hand, you've got the person who believes he can eat all things. He's not filled with doubts regarding the various matters. He is confident instead, as we saw in verse number 2, he's confident, he believes that he is able to eat all things. On the other hand, you've got a weak person who only believes that it's only the herbs or the vegetables that are to be eaten. These are clearly very differing opinions. The opinions are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but each one of them have a responsibility to each other. The one who believes that he can go ahead and eat all things is commanded, do not despise him that eateth not. And it literally is stop despising him. And the word despise suggests that of showing by your attitude or a manner of treatment that that person has no merit or worth. Boy, let me tell you, this has plagued churches today. Okay? Somebody disagrees and immediately they are cast off as being heathens. We don't want anything to do with them. The preachers who are extremely insecure cannot deal with somebody who might disagree with them. They can't have a differing of opinion because that might in some way come back to mess up their authority level. There's a lot of problems with that mindset that is going on there. Do not, and literally stop doing this, stop showing by either an attitude or by a treatment of someone that person who believes that he can only eat certain things, that he has no merit or worth. Notice Romans 14, now verse number 3. The contrast on the other side, let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth. On the other side, the person who chooses to not eat meats and only eat herbs must not judge the one who chooses to eat meat. And again, the action, the tense of the command suggests action that is to stop. Let's say, avoid passing an unfavorable judgment or avoid criticizing. You ever notice we have all the answers? Okay? Some of you, I know you do, and I'm not trying to tread on that in any way, shape, or form. You just ask. Some of you are so gracious I don't even have to ask. You'll already tell me. It's amazing to me in college athletics, and particularly football, it's amazing to me how many spectators know the play that should be called. Okay? It's amazing how many spectators yell at the quarterback to tell him to not get sacked. Like he's just sitting there wanting to get sacked by a guy who is 300-some pounds. Okay? Get away from him. What do you think he's trying to do? Okay? He's seeing things at a different level than everyone else is seeing them. Isn't it amazing how much referees miss in any sport? Basketball, football, doesn't matter what it is. Okay? And now we sit back there and we criticize and criticize and criticize. Why? Because we're watching instant replay. And we're watching it in slow motion. Time after time after time after time. And then they freeze it right there on that foul. And it's like, that's obvious. How could they not call it? If it's affecting your team adversely. If they're not calling it, affects your team positively, it's just part of the game. Refs miss things, okay? It is amazing how much we criticize each other. I saw the score for the Panthers game just before I came in here. How in the world did we get beat by Minnesota? I have no idea. It's bound to be the referee's fault. Somewhere, okay? It's amazing how critical we can be sometimes. If you are a person who is prone to having a critical spirit, I want to encourage you to make that a matter of prayer, because what you will find is that you will destroy people unintentionally by your criticism. It is oftentimes, I think, very difficult for us to understand. I think sometimes we think we are doing people a favor, but sometimes that criticism isn't always received well. It may not always be delivered well. It's not to say that you intended on it being received in an improper way, but should we be known as individuals who are critical of things? We really shouldn't. As parents, we should not create a standard that is impossible for our children to follow and to adhere to, and criticize them when they don't. It's easy to find fault with our children, is it not, parents? Okay? We have to focus on the praise. And for some of us, including myself, that is a conscious effort. Okay? The bad ideas are blatantly obvious to me. I see them. Don't do that. Okay? All of the good things that they do, they did one this year, I know. Okay, no, I'm teasing. All of the good things they do, I have to put a focus on and say, wow, thank you for doing that. Okay? We get a very harsh and very critical spirit towards someone who disagrees with us. And that is exactly what Paul says on both of these accounts. You stop doing that. Whether you are the person who eats meat, then don't despise, don't mistreat those who do not do so. If you're the person who says, you know what, I'm only going to eat herbs, and don't criticize the other person. Why? Because God has received them. Same word that was used back in verse number 1, where we were commanded to receive ye. God has received them. God's welcomed that person. Okay? Understand that and recognize that, number one, there are differing levels of maturity. Number two, recognize God has welcomed both individuals. Leads us to a third principle. Recognize ultimately that God is the judge. Verse 4, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth, yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. To illustrate this truth, he uses a concept about which they were very familiar, the relationship between a slave or a servant and a master. The Bible is not condoning this kind of behavior. The reality is this was what was going on at the time that it was written. It was a relationship that they all understood, the servant to the master. He asks the question, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? In other words, what gives you the right to think that you can pass judgment upon or look favorably upon or look unfavorably upon or criticize another man's servant? Do you possess that level of authority? No. That man does not answer to you. He instead answers to his own master. He is therefore the concern of his master and, quite honestly, of no one else. To whom is every Christian ultimately accountable? God. Let me put it to you this way. You are God's problem. If you've got the wrong idea, He can correct it. Let's reverse it. I am God's problem. Okay? Boy, does He have His hands full. All right? He's been putting in a lot of time, for sure. But nonetheless, I am God. If I have an incorrect view, God knows how to change that. Have you found over the years that your views on certain things has changed? Some things that at one point in time you were just adamant about, you no longer are, and then those things that you never were adamant about, suddenly you are because you see the danger of some of those things. Some of you have had the experiences of, we'll say, life. You're pretty adamant about not engaging or not allowing children or your family to engage in certain behavior because you know where that road leads. You've been there, done that, and it's not happening. You understand that, okay? And then you don't want that for there. And so God then is ultimately the one who is perfectly capable of of correcting the individual. So why then should he be the victim of mistreatment and unfair criticism when he's in reality done absolutely nothing wrong? Again, we're not dealing with issues that are biblically right and biblically wrong. God is the one, as the verse concludes, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. God is ultimately the one who is perfectly capable of making him stand. In other words, whether he stands or whether he falls, he is ultimately in God's hands. Avoid passing judgment on others. Some of the best advice that my dad ever gave me centered along these lines, that the closer I am to God, the more glaring my own sin is. The further I am from God, the more glaring everyone else's sin is. And I found that to be true in my own life. When I'm close to God, don't take this in a wrong way. And I don't have time to correct all of your problems because I got so many myself. How can I even criticize you because I think about all of this in my own life? I'm not here to criticize. Maybe someone you believe is engaged in something that is wrong. Pray about it. Let God work in that person's heart. And you will find that the transformation is absolutely remarkable when God does it. But when you get in the way and try to do God's work, what you'll find is you will alienate and you will only further divide. Maybe you are a person who is quick to judge. Let me encourage you to scale that back some. Maybe you're the person who has a very quick temper and you're quick to spout off what you think about so-and-so. Let me encourage you to scale that behavior. Those who are quick to run their mouth hopefully do not come across those who are quick to throw their fists. If you are quick to run your mouth, you may find one day you're missing some teeth, okay? And it'll be a painful lesson. It might be one of the best lessons that you ever had. Stop passing those kinds of judgments. There are different levels of maturity. You'll watch some immature Christians do some immature things. What's the solution? Maturity. Work with them. Patience. Growth. Avoid criticism. Avoid the judgment. And let's get them to where ultimately they need to be. Hopefully you'll observe mature Christians making mature decisions and responding in a mature way. And you know what is possible? Immature Christians and mature Christians alike can all dwell together in a proper spirit of unity when these principles are applied. Only God can do that. Only God can take this group of people, as we talked about all the different backgrounds, and unite us and make us who we truly are today. It's an amazing thing, and we rejoice in it. Let's stand.